Hello everyone, I'm Ryan the Raptor Guy, and welcome to episode number 2 of PaleoMania. Last time we started our 4-part mini-series called The True History of Life, and we looked at what the pre-flood world might have been like, what kind of ecosystems might have existed, and the animals that filled them. In this episode, we're going to look at the catastrophic event that destroyed the pre-flood world. Dinosaurs and a myriad of other now extinct animals flourished on the supercontinent of Rodinia for 1,650 years. There were trilobites scuttling across shallow seafloors, giant marine reptiles swimming through open oceans, large flying reptiles or pterosaurs soaring through the sky, humongous long-necked sauropods eating from our tallest trees, and herds of hadrosaurs roaming the land. And the herbivores, of course, were hunted by carnivorous creatures like the great Tyrannosaurus and other theropods. It was a really beautiful place, full of amazing creatures and diverse, beautiful ecosystems. But alas, it wasn't perfect. See, we read in Genesis chapter 6 that mankind was becoming really wicked and violent. They were sinful people. They were very sinful people. And they filled the whole world with so much violence and wickedness that 120 years before the end of the pre-flood era, God decided he'd had enough. He's a just God, and he's holy. So he needs to punish mankind's sin. So God decided to send a global flood to destroy every air-breathing, land-living animal and person in the world. Except a few, but we'll get to those in a minute. Now, before we go any further, let me just get something out of the way. This flood that we read about in Genesis, it was nothing like the flood we commonly hear about in Sunday school.
It rained and it poured for 40 long days. These daisies rained and it poured for 40 long days. These daisies almost drove those animals crazy, crazy children of the Lord.
Just stop, okay? Just stop. While most of the pre-flood population was wicked and violent and sinful, there was still one man, the Bible says, who still honored and feared God, and his name was Noah. God told Noah to build a giant vessel, an ark. So this way, he would be able to survive the upcoming flood, along with his family, which included his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives, and 2 of every kind of air-breathing, land-dwelling animal. The ark was absolutely nothing like we commonly see depicted in children's books and in Sunday school class, nothing like that. This wasn't a cute little bathtub-shaped boat with a little giraffe neck sticking out of the sides and all these animals crammed into it, still like smiling and being happy and yay. No. This ark was nothing like those Sunday school abominations. It was huge. The Bible says that the ark was 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. That's roughly 510 feet long, 85 feet wide, and over 50 feet tall. This is huge. It shapes kind of like a barge, actually. The dimensions of the ark matched that of a modern-day cargo ship. This was so that the ark would have the perfect balance of stability, carrying space, and comfort. This was an ark designed to handle the onslaught of the flood. Once the ark's construction was complete, God brought 2 of every kind of air-breathing terrestrial animal to Noah to put on board the ark, and 14 of some animals, the clean ones to be specific. Notice what's important here. Noah was told to bring on board every land-dwelling, air-breathing animal. So this wouldn't count things like fish or trilobites or marine reptiles or any of the invertebrates, really, because they don't really breathe like vertebrate animals do. They don't have nostrils from which to breathe. They breathe out of holes in the sides of their bodies. So they wouldn't have been on the ark either. So it wouldn't have been nearly as many animals as a lot of people would think. Recent research suggests that there would have only been around 2,000 animals on the ark total, with about 1,000 different kinds of animals, because remember there's 2 of each kind and 14 of some kinds, but there would have been only around 2,000 animals total. Dinosaurs also were present on the ark, as they were land animals and they breathed air. Now, it's true that a lot of dinosaurs grew very big, and there were over 1,000 different species of dinosaurs. Noah was only told to bring 2 of every kind of air-breathing land animal. So he only would have needed 2 of each kind of dinosaur. How many kinds or families of dinosaurs were there? Well, scientists suggest that there would have only been about 50 to 60 kinds of dinosaurs total. So that's a total of about 100 dinosaurs on the ark. It's also important to remember that not all dinosaurs were huge. When we commonly think of dinosaurs, we think of the big sauropods and T-Rex and Triceratops, that lot. But the average dinosaur was actually about that of an American bison, which is an animal that only weighs about a ton or 2. So not really that big. And many were smaller than that, like Protoceratops and Psittacosaurus, Velociraptor, and Ichi. It's also likely that God would have brought younger or juvenile, teenage, if you will, dinosaurs on the ark instead of the fully grown adults to represent the larger kinds. This is so that they would eat less food while on the ark, they wouldn't take up as much space, and they'd live longer to reproduce after the flood was over. Once Noah, his family, and all the animals were loaded on the ark, God shut the door. Outside, all chaos was about to break loose. Again, I'm going to emphasize this flood was nothing like the one in Sunday school. The Bible says that at the beginning of the flood, the fountains of the deep were broken up. Creation geologists believe this refers to the splitting up of the Earth's crust during the flood. According to the catastrophic plate tectonics model developed by Dr. John Baumgartner, this was when thousands and thousands of miles of the Earth's crust were broken up and split all across the pre-flood globe. Like a conveyor belt, the mantle rose up through these giant cracks, and when 2,000 degree Fahrenheit rock made contact with the cooler seawater, a lot of the seawater vaporized, and it shot tens of thousands of feet up into the air, up into the atmosphere. But it didn't stay there for long. Genesis says that the windows of heaven were opened, and rain fell all over the earth in a torrential downpour. The earth was drenched in this downpour for 40 straight days and nights. Scientists recently discovered another potential mechanism: giant subterranean bodies of water underneath the Earth's crust. These bodies of water are even larger than our oceans, and they're still underneath our Earth's crust today. They might have further supplied our pre-flood oceans with water, enabling them to flood over the continents. As the Earth's crust continued to split, the supercontinent of Rodinia itself was split up into smaller landmasses, but not into the 7 continents we're familiar with today. First, the fragments of Rodinia came together again to form the supercontinent of Pangaea, which broke up later in the flood to form our modern 7 continents. As if the breakup of the Earth's crust and the shifting continents wasn't enough, during the flood we also have evidence for massive volcanic eruptions. Not only volcanoes, we just have these pits where lava literally just comes bubbling out, like in places like the Deccan Traps in Siberia. We also find evidence that during the flood, the Earth was hit by a number of large meteorites and asteroids, one of which hit the Yucatan Peninsula. If this type of flood that I'm talking about occurred, what kind of evidence would we expect to find? Well, as one famous creationist puts it, we would expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the Earth. And that's exactly what we find. You will recall from a previous episode of PaleoMania that the Earth's geologic column is split into 3 groupings: the Paleozoic, which is the bottom grouping of rock layers, the Mesozoic, which is the medium grouping of rock layers, and the Cenozoic up at the top. I also mentioned that the Paleozoic and Mesozoic rock layers represent ecosystems that were swept away in the flood and buried in rapid succession. Well, during the flood, vast tsunami-like waves of sediment-rich water would have rushed toward the continents, wiping out ecosystem after ecosystem, all the plants and animals that lived in a certain area and elevation, and would have swept them away and buried them. This explains the order that we find in the fossil record. At the very bottom, we find shallow water marine creatures, followed by coastal animals, and later inland creatures like dinosaurs. The breakup of the Great Deep would have initiated huge earthquakes. These earthquakes would have caused the edges of the continental shelf and the Cambrian sea ecosystems that I talked about that lived on these continental shelves. It would have caused them to collapse, and they would become rapidly swept away and rapidly buried elsewhere. Rapid burial is important to the fossilization of these amazing, exquisite fossils that we find. For example, in some rock layers we find fossils of jellyfish, a creature without bones. How do you fossilize something without bones? But we find these jellyfish fossils, and they're actually pretty common in the fossil record, and that is the result of rapid burial during the flood. As the waves of destruction continued toward the coast, Carboniferous coal forests were ripped apart violently. Billions and billions of tree trunks were swept further out into the ocean. While many of the tree trunks continued to float, many of them sank down to the bottom, and they became buried in deep, thick mud. This is where the tree trunks were compressed and coalified and turned into the coal seams that we find today. Following the destruction of the Carboniferous coal forests, the waves would have destroyed vast coastal regions of Rodinia. Next, after destroying the Carboniferous coal forest, these tsunami-like waves would have ravaged Rodinia's coastlines. It would have swept away animals and plants and buried them elsewhere in Permo-Triassic sandstone rock layers that we still find around us today. Interestingly, in many cases we find the fossil footprints of organisms like trilobites and Permian amphibians and sometimes dinosaurs before we actually find their body fossils. Why is that? Well, that's because these animals were running for a little bit to escape the floodwaters before being swept away. As the sea level continued to rise during the flood, the inland ecosystems would have become inundated. The Jurassic and Cretaceous animals and plants, like the ones in the ecosystems before, would have been swept out to sea and buried on top of those previously deposited animals and plants. This explains why it's a common phenomenon to find dinosaurs and other land animals buried with marine creatures like clams and oysters and sharks, plesiosaurs and mosasaurs, and even sea turtles. Why would we find all these animals buried together if they were not buried in a catastrophic global flood? After flooding all the lowland regions of the pre-flood world, the pre-flood uplands were inundated by raging water. All the ecosystems and environments where humans and large mammals would have lived would have been destroyed and buried. While the torrential downpours only lasted 40 days and 40 nights, the flood itself lasted much, much longer. After day 40, the water continued to rise. It rose until it covered even the highest mountains of that time, under at least 20 feet of water. This was no local flood. By day 150, all the land was covered, and every land-dwelling, air-breathing animal and person not on the ark had drowned. It is also on the 150th day that the fountains of the deep were shut off, and the waters finally began to recede. The ark came to rest in the mountains of Ararat. Even though they were slowing down, plate tectonics were still shifting underneath the ocean waters. Oftentimes, when two continental plates were to come together, they'd form a mountain range. This is how the Himalayas were formed. Finally, on the 370th day since the flood began, the earth was finally dry enough for humans and animals to recolonize the earth. Usually by this point, most people think that the world was pretty fine and dandy since the flood was over. No more rain, no more catastrophe, just sunshine and rainbows.
The sun came out and dried up the landy, landy. Sun came out and dried up the landy, landy. Everything was fine and dandy, dandy.
No, it wasn't anything like that. At this point, the Earth was anything but settled down. In fact, the next few centuries following the flood were characterized by rapid climate fluctuations, new breeds of really strange and weird creatures, and a time when a third of the Earth's landmass was covered by ice. But we'll talk about that next time. Thank you for watching today's episode of PaleoMania. Please be sure to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe below for more content just like this, follow me on Instagram, and remember, every fossil has a story to tell. See you next time.